Hi. We're finally online. I'm hoping that this is going to work and that the quality will be sufficient. Let me just check the volume before we get too far. Yeah, volume is full. Yeah, so I apologize for not having posted the recording at the same time, but there was no decent Wi-Fi where I was yesterday, so it took me a little time to get to it. Um, so the topic for this week is global policies versus local meaning. So we've looked at globalization, internationalization. We started talking about the dangers of globalization and what it can mean, particularly for people in the global south, the dangers and concerns. You formulated them onto the forum last week, the virtual forum last week. So now we're going a little further and perhaps placing terminology, some of those concepts that we've already started unpacking. And some of that terminology is going to enable us to go deeper into some very specific concerns that we have when it comes to internationalization, but particularly globalization, or globalization hiding as internationalization for people in the global south, particularly for teachers and for educational practitioners in the global south. So the objectives to this week were to consider the conflict that exists between global north ambitions and the global education, those in the global south. We started out, but we're going more depth. Bring to the surface the tension in theoretical stances between neoliberalism with a typo there and critical pedagogy. So we've been really talking about this already. What I'm doing is I'm now putting a name on it. I think for most of you, it's not complicated because I think the ones that are in cohort sort of format have already done, I think, their critical pedagogy course. For those of you who haven't, it's just a matter of getting the key elements from the web. There's an enormous amount of things, right? So Paulo Freire in the 70s wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and then it started as a school of thought, a school of educational philosophy. There's a lot of nutshell sort of websites that you can get the essential sort of learning bites from. You don't obviously have to unpack it fully for this course, but it's going to be interesting having that concepts to fall back on, because what we've been discussing in some of the media sources and certainly in the discussions last week was this tension between globalization and internationalization. Globalization being underpinned by neoliberalism, but what we haven't discussed explicitly is that internationalization in its true form, in its authentic form, along with the text we've seen for the first half of the course, is really about critical pedagogy. It's about empowering people. It's about giving people who don't have a voice, giving them a voice, and giving them a tool for transformative action, which really is another word that critical pedagogy has created for this process of emancipation, of freedom, of getting free, of making yourself free through education specifically. Then we had submitting for the online guest speaker. We've done that on Mondays. It's been done, and examining any remaining questions around assignment 4 and 5. So this I will say right away. I don't think I have a slide for this, so I'll forget. But I am not strict about deadlines. As long as at this stage you know that you see what you've got left to do, you see how many weeks you've got. There's an inherent inequity because you are not doing assignment 5 in the same week. So I can't penalize or enforce deadlines for assignment 4 when I know full well some of you are now working on assignment 5. You may have to actually submit assignment 4 after your assignment 5. That's totally fine. I'm sure your peers and your colleagues understand because they probably have another week. And in fact, because we fixed the March break to be a holiday, they are benefiting from 2 extra weeks. So really, at this stage, whatever works for you works for me. I'm going to start marking what I have, and then when I'll get the other ones in, I'll mark those. It's not an issue. Only concerns I have, and it's not even a concern, but if there's some of you that feel that you're falling behind and you don't think you'll be finished by the end of the course, then obviously maybe start a conversation with me, and then we can monitor this on one-on-one to make sure that you do finish within the timelines. Because I know sometimes when I say I don't care about deadlines, other students say, but I want you to impose the deadlines because otherwise I'll never finish. I can play that role if you want. And if you need me to play that role to make sure that you finish on time, we can do that on one-on-one. But for the whole class, I'm not going to be imposing those deadlines. You're grown-ups, you're all adults, you have a career, and you are navigating lots of things. As long as you finish by the end, we're all good. Global North visions of internationalization, globalization. So you've got a couple of documents that I had actually slid into section 8 because they were relevant. So you have this one, a document by Oxford University. And the reason why I put it there and I'm asking you to look at the main features highlighted in the internationalization of higher education, is to make you aware that as soon as we talk about internationalization, which should be about global education, so it should be about creating, meaningful and reciprocal collaborations with people in the global south. It should be about rectifying inequities in wealth and in resources. It should be about fully immersing people in experiences that they would not have had in their nation state. So that's very much about critical pedagogy. But when we talk about internationalization in higher ed, for example, I wanted you to go through the documents to really be interesting if you take a highlighter and you manage to print the document. Just take every word that refers to marketing vocabulary, branding vocabulary, income and revenue and finance. You're going to see an awful lot of yellow on that page, right? Because we start off with internationalization very quickly, we slip into globalization because really those concerns are not the ones that are essential to internationalization. It's unfortunately about markets often, right? But I'll let you discuss on the virtual forum. Global South perspective, and really this is the point of this whole sort of section. Having looked at the global North perspective, we're now looking at a global South perspective and looking, and as I said, assigning specific terminology to some of the concerns we've started to have, but now we can unpack them fully. So you have a text, and I think I had also skipped that one in section 8. No, it's the last in text. Okay. So right stocking is in the right section. It's in section 9. You have that reading to do. And you have another one, which is called Larson, which I put in section 8 because it was already relevant to section 8. And as I say, this is a tip, right? We tell you to read articles. Don't forget that, as we've seen for the review, an article always has the same structure. So really, we don't always expect you to do a linear reading of an article. No one does. What you do is you read at the abstract, you look at what's interesting for you, and then you jump straight to that section because you know exactly where that section is going to be. So some articles you read because the methodology is interesting. You're learning about methodology. You want to see what the methodological process is. But if that's not your interest, you can jump that. You can read it in your leisure, you can read it in the holidays, but that's not the section you're going to read for the course. You're going to go straight to the findings. You're going to go straight maybe to the discussion. You're going to go straight to what relates to the topic that you're discussing, right? So just a little tip on reading. And in this instance, I'm really insisting that you find in the abstract what it is that's relevant and then you jump straight to there because you know you're tight for time. So if we look at some of the concerns of the global south, one of those terms is global appropriation. So you do have a text on global appropriation, but if you don't have time, again, it's UDL, giving you lots of different pathways. If you like reading the text, some of you will love that, and you have the full journal article to read. Otherwise, we have some video and a couple of videos, and then you have two newspaper articles, so much smaller than a journal article, much more popular culture vocabulary, and much easier to access. So choose whichever works for you. But I would like you to be able to articulate what global appropriation is in the virtual forum. We discussed it a lot in terms of indigenous education, but you've got to understand really in Canada and in Australia, we talk about continuing internal colonization. We came and we didn't leave. So that colonization is continuing. So we talk about internal colonization. But the dynamics and the vocabulary that we use for that relationship and for decolonizing and things like this is going to be very similar to situations that we have in countries where we've left, but we continue to have that experience. We continue to have those intentions, and therefore that needs to change too. So you're going to see a nice parallel between the vocabulary and some of the terminology that's used internally for us in Australia, looking at indigenous communities and that internal continuing colonization, and the process that they followed independence in countries in the global south, where they are still subject to those processes being perpetuated, as we've seen them perpetuate in different ways, not because we are the colonizing power, but maybe because we impose a language instruction, we impose our banks, we impose our textbooks, and I'm throwing things in different order here. We impose a scholarship system, we hijack the elite students to ensure that they actually study for higher ed in our country. So those are ways in which we perpetuate that process. So cultural appropriation, we see it in Canada, and we often see it articulated with regards to indigenous community, but it's going to be just as powerful when you look at global south versus global north. So you need to unpack that. It's going to be very important for us as a concern within global education for the global south. The next one is acculturation. I can never pronounce the word, so you can pronounce it whichever way you want. I think there's many ways to pronounce it, but basically loss of culture in the process of global education. So you've got a journal article again, you've got a video, and you have a website. So again, three different pathways to enter that, depending on how much time you have, what your interest with that concept is. But at least try and engage a little bit so you can actually give me a little bit of a synthesis on the virtual form, and you can exchange with your peer to make sure that you're looking at all aspects of the question. Really, really important because this is something that perhaps, the things like cultural appropriation, ongoing, post-colonialism, issues with decolonizing the curriculum, we've seen those coming. We knew that these were issues in global education and they would have to be tackled. But acculturation we never saw coming. I think it's a process that's happened before people and scholars started to analyze it, and so it's even more important because it's not discussed in journal articles because we see it as a theoretical threat. It's discussed in journal articles because we've already seen the casualties and we've already, the literature has come out of the misery that those students are living, and that's why it's an even more pressing issue. And that's one of the results of global education. And we need to look at that and see how we can reduce that and ensure that that doesn't occur. Because that, again, doesn't align with all of the ambitions and the goals that we stated in week 2, week 3, week 4 when we were unpacking the literature on global education. But it's unfortunately really associated with them. And then we had this notion of decolonizing the curriculum. So again, this is something that we see used in Canada and Australia with regards to our perpetuated sort of colonizing process, internal colonizing process. But it's very important too because countries that have gained independence in the 60s and 70s want to decolonize their curriculum, right? We're no longer there, but they still very much feel that that curriculum is colonized, and they are also battling that. So you have a video from SOAS, which is School of Oriental and African and Oriental Studies in London, which has been where the student union has been very instrumental in triggering country-wide, let's say, discussions around decolonizing the curriculum. Why? Well, because it's a school really, and it explains in the video that I was creating during the colonial ages to form basically elites that would go and rule the empire. So the very fact that that school continues to operate and pretty much operates in the same way, but with a different clientele, which now comes from the global south, creates a lot of unease and a lot of contradictions. So it's obvious it's a form where that would have come to the forefront. It's an interesting place to keep an eye on because there's a lot of dynamic things going on there and being formulated in very elusive ways by students. So it's really interesting to watch. And then you have a document from New Zealand there as well, which gives you another pathway to enter that if you want. You also will find a lot of literature on this. But when you do a search, try and avoid the Canadian and the Australian, which will refer again to something slightly different. It's about decolonizing curriculum with regards to internal colonization, but look rather at maybe South African authors. There's a lot of literature coming from South Africa, particularly South African higher ed, about decolonizing the curriculum. Now, for K-12 teachers, the majority of which you are, there's not that much literature on decolonizing the curriculum in the global south for teachers, but there's an awful lot on K-12, and often you can transfer and shift those concepts very with ease onto K-12. It's the same problem. It just hasn't been discussed enough in the literature, and you can see why. If you're a K-12 teacher in a global south, well, publishing we haven't discussed much. I discussed in the example I gave about globalization in education, that publishing was bad. I meant mostly textbook, but think as well that journal articles are multinationals, and they are certainly not the best at amplifying the voice of global South scholars. So that's another example where you see globalization. So, it's hard enough to be a K-12 teacher in a global South, to be battling resources, to be conceptualizing all this, maybe publishing, but also to get it into the platforms. There's a whole bunch of power inequities there that are certainly hard to fight. And that's why you're not seeing these articles and these voices in the journals, not because that reflection isn't happening. And then opportunities. So you've seen that I like to do this, right? We're in a weird landscape of ultra neoliberalism, of ultra globalization, lots of nasty things happening in politics, in social structures. that threaten a lot of people. But I think it's also important that we stay grounded and that we try to see the opportunities in even a negative landscape. So I've talked about this at the end of last session, and I think at the end of this chapter too, we need to see if something positive cannot be gained in a landscape that's basically counterproductive. So the landscape, we've seen it, we've described it, there's going to be phenomena of acculturation, of difficulties with decolonizing the curriculum, of cultural appropriation. All of these things are there, and they are definitely big concerns for the global south. But does it mean that the global south should just make a cross against internationalization, or even if it's globalization, and say, no, we're not taking part? Or should they make a pact with the devil and say, there's something for me to be won here, so I'm going to play the game because ultimately I can still get something that serves my global south voice? So an example I wanted to give you was, for example, the indigenous voice. So it is often sort of stated that indigenous demands for truth and reconciliation, for recognition of indigenous status, are clashing with any effort of internationalization. That really they are about regionalization, they're not about internationalization. Therefore, a lot of people and a lot of scholars argue that it's impossible to reconcile the claims of indigenous people with the current climate of internationalization and globalization. Now, that might be the truth, and you will see the indigenous communities split. So you will see in some countries, in some communities, in even within communities sometimes, people who are adamant that we should try and make the best of globalization and get our message out there to get what we want. And you get the other half saying, no, no, we should actually focus on regionalization, which is make a cross on that and not even attempt it. So I want to give you an example of when it's been successful. So I don't know if all of you are familiar with the history of the Crees in Quebec, but basically in 1975, I think, but you've got some documents that follow the history. Quebec unilaterally decides that it's going to grow its hydropower capacity, and then decides to create the hydro dams in the north. They started with Hydro 1, Hydro 2. They built several and basically blocked all the major rivers in northern Quebec to create some of the largest dams in the world. At the time, they were largest dams in the world. I don't know if they still are. And that process really hasn't stopped because there's still some being built now. But it does so unilaterally. So it floods areas that are several times the size of France. It's actually phenomenal. And relocates or force relocates most of the Cree nations. And then does the sort of forced settlement, right? Because the Crees are actually semi-nomadic, so they actually move back to the bay during the summer and then live along the trap lines during the winter mostly, and that's a very traditional way of living for the Quebec Crees. But sort of forces sedentarization, creates these fake communities and says you must relocate there, which obviously has created lots of issues with forced urbanization and things like this, with poor, obviously, water quality, poor lodging and accommodation, poor sort of municipal structures. So for a little while there, I think Quebec thought that was getting away, and the Crees were arguing that this was obviously a breach of their ancestral rights to the land, that there should at least be compensation, that they should have actually been consulted. And really, this turns on empty for about a year and a half because no one really cares at that time. We're not in 2020 in the TRC. There's actually very few people listening to those revendications. And Matthew Kuhn at the time decides that he's going to go to New York and he's going to make a speech at the UN. And that is really an example of a regional sort of interest deciding that it wants that international platform, and that's probably the best thing he could ever have done, because he did make that speech at the UN, and that forced the Canadian government to take notice and then to put pressure on the Quebec government, and there was more and more international pressure on the Quebec government, and that led to the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, which is a huge treaty, one of the largest financial compensation to First Nations and First Nations communities in Canada. It's a treaty that still continues. There's been other installments and things added to it. So it's a good illustration, I think, of the ambivalence and the dichotomy that exists in global South voices or Indigenous voices in Australia and Canada when it comes to either focusing on the regional to protect identity, to protect the authenticity of voice, to protect a focus on things that matter locally. And on the other hand, the understanding and awareness that by playing the game and jumping on the international and globalization platform, you have a lot to gain, and you can gain things that you would never have gained if you'd ignore it. And I think when global South voices or indigenous voices do this, they do this really thinking of the notion of pact with the devil. That really it's not because you want to, but it's because by doing that you may actually achieve more for your community. So not in a way, not all is bad in globalization, even when it is counterproductive, when it's negative, when there's lots of flags being raised. There are still opportunities that are there that need to be identified. And I think if at your level graduate studies, you have to be starting to be at ease with dichotomies and concepts. So I don't think we can finish the course by just saying globalization is all bad. Globalization is this difficult, hard landscape which only favors the voice of the majority. But ironically, sometimes a minority group and a voice from Global South or from indigenous communities can use it to change their minority discourse into a majority discourse and get the power that they want to get what they want done. And you're seeing this happen more and more. Another example I wanted to give you was WIPSI. So WIPSI, if you've never been, is an interesting conference. I've attended 3 times. It's a World Indigenous Peoples Conference on Education. It happens every 3 years. Massive event, draws much attention, leads to really concrete things, networking, collaborations, because Indigenous people from around the world, from Lapland, the strangest sort of discourses and exchanges and dialogues that you've ever seen. Obviously, you expect, as I've seen before, Northern Crees go to New Zealand and start a very easy dialogue about Indigenous education because the structures and variables that affect them are very similar, and they've been colonized by the same country. But seeing Finnish Lap people talking to Chilean Indigenous people around the table about commonalities of their educational struggles. It's interesting. It's very interesting, and there's a lot to gain from keeping an eye on this conference and attending if you ever can. Now, it's a very critical pedagogy conference because you have to be indigenous to present, and so they've made them that their agenda that you can be a co-presenter if you're non-indigenous, but you cannot be a lead presenter, and you can't present on your own. So it is specifically putting the focus on global South voice. And again, it's global. It definitely plays a little bit of neoliberal. It's run like every other conference. It's definitely an enterprise model, but it is an incredible opportunity for people who would not have a voice or certainly would not connect with other minority in other countries that get this incredible opportunity to do this on the scale of the planet. So again, they are wedges. They are opportunities for incredible things to happen in a landscape that obviously we can only be concerned about because of that inherent focus on markets, right? But it would be wrong at your stage, I think, of graduate sort of awareness to just see things in black and white. You've got to get more nuanced about it. So that's why I want every time to finish with that you don't just finish by saying, yes, we've seen all the concerns about globalization, but what can be done? What can be done in a landscape that we can't necessarily do much about it? Can we still create pockets where we get to do what we want in terms of global education, even if the whole landscape isn't conducive to it as a whole? And so, yeah, just to recap, in the last 2 sessions, every time we talk about globalization, we were talking about the underpinning theory, which is neoliberalism. I'm not going to go over it again because we've explained it several times. But what we hadn't put a label on is that the internationalization sort of discourse, going back really to what we started discussing at the beginning of the semester, but we hadn't put a theoretical sort of premise behind it. It's mostly about critical pedagogy. What is critical pedagogy? As framed by Freire, I'll repeat for those who haven't taken the course, in 1970s. Don't forget he's Brazilian, right? We forget about this. So he writes in a post-colonial environment. It's very important to remember this. It fits perfectly well with our course on global education and a global South voice. He writes about the fact that in a post-colonial society, education, traditional education, is a banking model, that it's become a factory sort of I don't know, you call it factory sort of process work, where the teacher is a factory worker and literally drops why banking model, because they drop knowledge as a commodity into little piggy banks, which are the students who receive it passively. So he challenges both principles, the fact that knowledge is not a commodity, because Freire and critical pedagogy really integrates constructivism. So the fact that knowledge is not something, an entity on itself that exists by itself, and that's certainly not something that a teacher has and can pass on physically to the learner. Knowledge is constructed actively by the learner themselves. So it doesn't have an existence in itself. It's only in the mind of the learner themselves, and it's an autonomous process. It's not something that's given to them. So he challenges that, and then he challenges the fact that is education. He says really when we drop something in a student in a passive way, it's not education. So he then advocates that the teacher changes that. And how do they change that? They change that by, first of all, creating an awareness in the student that that's what's happening in traditional education. That's a very important point, because he says that it is run so well that learners do not realize that they are passive and they're forced into this passive role. So they could happily go on, and if you don't shake them out of that on the lack of awareness, they will not realize. So your first role as a teacher is to create. We don't have an English word to translate because it's translated from Portuguese. In French, we prise de conscience, right? For those of you who speak French, prise de conscience. So it's the act of becoming conscious. So it's not consciousness; it's really the act of becoming conscious. So the teacher has to shake the students and create opportunities for the student to realize this passive role that education cannot give to them. And then it's about making the learner realize they have an identity, and that learning should be about their identity. So it's about helping, supporting them as they find identity. How do you do that? Well, you support them by finding a voice, because you don't have an identity before you have a voice, and we don't give voice to students in education. So he argues that that's the second step, is to support them as they find voice. And then you amplify that voice, because unless you amplify it and you find opportunities for it to become loud, it will remain very shy, because again, the system is against them. So it's about a teacher finding ways in the classroom to amplify that voice. And then hopefully when you've done all that, you are creating an opportunity for transformative action. Transformative action is really what critical pedagogy wants to see, or critical theory even. That means that you're not just discussing this, but it's actually changing the power dynamics. So by the end of this process, the learner is able to liberate themselves. So Freire will talk about of freeing themselves, of emancipation. So freeing themselves from an educational system that doesn't want them to be free. And that's your role as a teacher, to trigger all this and support it and amplify it. So you see that it's very, very closely linked to everything we discussed in global education. It's really the subtext there of global education. It's not always made explicit, I found, in text, but really you're going to find that most people that talk authentically about global education, they have a critical pedagogy foundation in theory. And so what we're seeing between internationalization and globalization, should put it the other way, between globalization and internationalization, because then I mirror the way I put it there, is globalization is underpinned by neoliberalism, internationalization is underpinned by critical pedagogy. So what you're seeing behind, and why it's such a fierce discourse, right? In the last week, I gave you examples from the newspapers, and I said there's that debate. It's not even a dialogue anymore, right? Because people do not understand each other. Why don't they understand each other? Why is it such a hard debate? Because really they are adhering to completely different theoretical styles. And it's very difficult to get people to think outside their theory, because there's something that is subjectively choose because it fits their worldview, and then they can actually articulate all of their thinking and certainly all of their research and science within the theoretical stance that they have adopted. And that's what you're seeing in the field. Some people really are conceiving everything within neoliberalism, other people are conceiving everything within critical pedagogy. And it's very hard to then dialogue across those theoretical boundaries. I put a caveat there about anti-globalization movement in current politics. That's interesting too, because traditionally, up to about, well, 2016, I guess, and Brexit 2015, we had a clear divide that the left was pro-critical theory and by extension critical pedagogy, and the right was pro-neoliberalism, right? And it was very fairly clear. But everything started shaking because from 2015 is part of the right that discovered that they could reach their votes sort of pool into the left by playing on the fact that people were scared about globalization. So it's not because they are anti-globalization, but they've realized that they can continue being pro-globalization, but have a discourse which is anti-globalization, which enables them to go to the left and actually pull some votes. It's very efficient. You've seen it with Trump. You've seen it with Brexit. You've seen it with measures just being reelected by poaching voters on the opposite extreme of ideologically. And so this is interesting because, well, it's not interesting. It's kind of scary. But parties are now using globalization fear to reach people that have an ideology that's opposite to theirs. And this is what's making politics so complicated. So when you're doing these readings and you're looking at some of the websites I've shown you, you've got to really differentiate between people who are really anti-globalization, normally very much on the left, and people who are on the right, but are playing an anti-globalization card because they simply want to expand their voter pool into the left, and it's working very, very efficiently. So that's another added complexity for you, but it shouldn't overshadow the fact that you have now a clear idea of the theory and the theoretical position. Politics is sometimes more Machiavellian, right? It's more complex. It's not just about clear boundaries, it's about maximizing your potential to be elected. And people are doing very strange ideological salads at the moment, right? Mix and matching things that shouldn't be mixed because it just works in their favor. It's bound to create problems because people end up voting for something that they don't believe in simply because someone has tapped into their fears. But we will see how that unfolds. But just to be aware of that extra complexity when you're looking at current affairs. So I hope this answers all your questions for this week. I encourage you to share, and you're doing some great stuff, responding to each other. And the point is that it's not to talk to me, it's to talk to each of you, and to unpack and develop those discussions around what we bring to the surface every week. So I will leave it there. You've seen a group already has set a meeting for Friday the 13th. I'm going to see you on Saturday to discuss this a little bit further, mostly for any questions, I think. I'll try and make it interactive. I don't know what my Wi-Fi connection is going to be like because I'll be somewhere yet different, but I'll try it on Friday. That way I'll know ahead on Saturday that everything's working. We might keep it a little bit short so that I don't over sort of use a connection that probably won't be very good. But if you have any questions, bring them to the Saturday Collaborate session. If you can't be there, email them to me so I can still discuss them live because I think it's always easier when you get your answer live from me on screen. And then I will see one group on the 13th. The other group, you would need to connect with me to be able to see when you want to do your presentation. If it's, let's say, Tuesday, Monday would be okay. Tuesday, I'm on a plane, so that would not work. Wednesday, I'm back in BC, but I'm moving from Victoria to Vancouver late in the evening, so that would not work. Thursday night would work. Friday's taken, unless you want to back-to-back. That's always a possibility, but I'm thinking you might be exhausted after listening to 2 sessions plus the feedback. If we're constrained, if we don't have a choice, we'll do it. But it's probably best not to choose that. Or you can choose the whole weekend. I'm back home and I'm there the whole weekend. So it's up to you. But once you've decided your project and you decided on your time, let me know and we'll confirm that. And I'll do the same. I'll do a post for the whole section. So have a good week and I'll speak to you on Saturday. Bye for now.